All right. So what are we seeing in the options market ahead of the August 1st deadline? Are we still seeing people trying to play it, even though we've seen a number of deals get done?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunities right now in terms of trying to buy some downside protection, but largely investors are not particularly bidding up puts ahead of this tariff deadline. It really reflects the fact that investors are not particularly concerned here. As you say, there's a fair amount of confidence that as you say, the tariffs will be manageable, right? Largely, I think we've seen pretty significant deals being done here in the last week that have contributed to that. Right now, obviously, India and the August 12th deadline with China is probably a bigger risk, in my opinion, especially with this concept of secondary tariffs with, being tied to buying Russian oil. That's probably, in my opinion, a bigger concern for investors. But largely, overall, investors do not seem overly concerned with that.
All right. We have some economic data coming up today and tomorrow that could potentially be market movers. PCE, let's start off there first. Headline PCE is forecast to tick up a few basis points. Are we starting to see traders make moves just to kind of game out the possible market reaction to that?
Yeah, I think this is right now probably the biggest potential market mover with the Fed's meeting yesterday is really just, investors trying to figure out whether or not inflation is going to tick up as a result of tariffs or if it's going to largely be manageable. And I think, so far what we've seen is a slight tick up in terms of inflation. But I think most investors at this moment, in terms of the base case, is believing that this inflation is not likely going to get out of hand, which is not necessarily going to require the Fed to raise interest rates. And I think a lot of investors feel that inflation is heading in the right direction and making meaningful progress to that 2% target, that it is potentially time to start considering cutting interest rates, especially if you consider kind of the weakness we've seen out of the labor market over the last 3 to 4 months now, really showing perhaps a little bit softer just economic activity overall that justifies, perhaps at least cutting another 25 basis points starting in September. And I think this is really where there's a lot of disagreement right now. That's kind of why we saw 2 dissenting votes yesterday with the Fed policy meeting, is the fact that there's starting to be a difference in opinion right now as to just how strong is the economy in terms of the labor market and really, whether or not we are going to see a tick up in inflation as a result of the tariffs.
We're going to get the answers today. We're with PCE, at least on the inflation part, and obviously the jobs report tomorrow. And again, as you mentioned, both have the potential to be market movers. So ahead of that, you're talking about delta put options. Exactly what is that and how does that help investors kind of play some of the potential volatility here?
Yeah, so I was looking at going out about 30 days out. If you can buy about a 30 delta put option on either SPY or SPX, depending on the size of your portfolio. And you can buy that for about 85 basis points. So you're under 1% of the stocks of your portfolio's value. You can hedge your portfolio for the next 30 days by a pretty significant margin if there is, for example, I think a good example of this is if, let's say, the Chinese tariff trade deal doesn't get done by August 12th and we don't get an extension, that is a potential market mover, right? Also, job numbers and inflation today and tomorrow are potential job movers. So this would protect you against all of those for only 85 basis points of your portfolio's value. That's the most you can potentially risk, and that doesn't cap your upside. And so we saw yesterday with Meta and Microsoft's earnings, it seems like the market is shrugging off some of these concerns, especially with the Fed, and feel that there's still plenty of optimism, plenty of upside here.